There are moments in Scripture that reveal something terrifyingly profound about the spiritual world. Moments that pull back the veil and show us that hell is not passive, not ignorant, and certainly not indifferent to the calling of certain people. One of those moments happens in the life of the Apostle Paul. Before he became the great preacher of grace, before he wrote letters that would shake the foundations of empires, hell already knew his name. Not because Paul had power of his own, but because God had placed a destiny upon him that would threaten the darkness itself. This is a truth many believers overlook. Hell does not waste energy attacking people who pose no threat. The enemy does not invest resources in those who are going nowhere spiritually. Resistance is not random. Opposition is not accidental. Spiritual warfare is not a sign of weakness. It is often evidence of calling. Paul's life reveals a spiritual pattern that still operates today. Long before he preached Christ, before he healed the sick, before he wrote a single epistle, something in the unseen realm recognized his future impact. That recognition triggered resistance, confusion, violence, delay, and suffering. Yet none of it worked. In fact, everything meant to stop him only shaped him into the man God intended him to be. This message is not just about Paul. It is about anyone who has ever felt targeted without understanding why. Anyone who has experienced unusual resistance, inner battles, spiritual confusion, or relentless pressure despite trying to do what is right. If you have ever felt like life was fighting you harder than others, there is a reason, and that reason may be deeper and more purposeful than you think. Today we will explore why hell knew who Paul was, how it tried to stop him, and what this reveals about spiritual warfare, divine calling, and the invisible battles that shape destiny. This is not just history, this is a mirror. And as you listen, you may begin to realize something unsettling yet empowering. The very resistance you face may be proof that heaven has already marked you for something greater. Hell recognizes threats before the world does. Before Paul ever preached Christ, before he healed the sick or planted churches, before his name was known among believers, hell already understood who he would become. This is one of the most misunderstood realities of spiritual warfare. Recognition in the spiritual realm does not depend on reputation in the natural world. The spiritual realm operates on assignment, destiny, and divine authorization, not visibility. Paul, then known as Saul of Tarsus, was not a Christian. He was a persecutor of the church. Yet even in his rebellion, something about his life made him dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. This is because God's call is not created in time. It exists before manifestation. Destiny precedes behavior. Purpose exists before obedience. Hell does not wait for you to succeed before reacting. It reacts when it senses potential alignment with God's will. This is why some people experience resistance early in life without understanding why. They face unusual hardships, rejection, confusion, or inner turmoil long before they even think about faith or purpose. The enemy is not responding to who they are, but to who they are becoming. Paul's encounter on the road to Damascus is one of the clearest examples of this principle. He was not seeking Christ. He was not questioning his beliefs. He was actively working against the followers of Jesus. And yet heaven intervened violently. Why? Because hell had already moved and heaven responded. The light that struck Paul blind was not punishment. It was interruption. God stopped him before hell could fully redirect his life into something destructive beyond repair. This shows a sobering truth. When hell recognizes potential, it either tries to destroy it or corrupt it. And when destruction fails, distraction becomes the next weapon. Many believers struggle because they misunderstand the origin of their battles. They think resistance means they are doing something wrong. In reality, resistance often means they are walking towards something that matters. Hell does not fight empty vessels. It fights carriers of purpose. Look at Paul's life after conversion. He was beaten, imprisoned, stoned, betrayed, misunderstood, and constantly threatened. Yet none of these attacks were random. Each one came at a moment when his influence was growing. Each trial coincided with expansion. Each hardship was timed. This is how the enemy works. He studies trajectories. He observes patterns. He watches how God develops people. And when he senses someone is about to step into impact, he applies pressure. But here is the truth that changes everything. Hell's awareness does not equal hell's authority. The demons who recognized Paul did not stop him. They identified him. In Acts 19, even evil spirits acknowledged the authority carried in his name. Jesus I know, and Paul I know. That statement alone reveals something chilling. Hell knew who Paul was, not because Paul was powerful, but because Christ had claimed him. And this is where many people misunderstand spiritual warfare. It is not about how strong you are. It is about who you belong to. Paul's power did not come from discipline, intelligence, or effort. It came from surrender. The moment he yielded to Christ, his life became a threat to darkness, not because he was perfect, but because he was aligned. This is why hell often attacks identity before action. If it can confuse you about who you are, it can delay what you are meant to do. If it can convince you that you are unworthy, broken, or insignificant, it can neutralize you without a fight. But the opposite is also true. The moment you begin to understand your calling, the moment you stop running from obedience, the moment you say yes to what God is asking, resistance increases, not because you are failing, but because you are finally moving. Paul did not escape suffering after conversion. He stepped into it. But that suffering had meaning. It refined him. It clarified his mission. It stripped him of pride. It trained him to rely on God rather than strength. And this is the pattern hell hates most. When suffering produces clarity instead of collapse, if you feel like life has been pushing back against you from every direction, consider this carefully. Maybe you are not under attack because you are weak. Maybe you are under attack because you are becoming dangerous to the darkness. The enemy does not fear talent. He fears obedience. He does not fear intelligence. He fears surrender. He does not fear ambition. He fears alignment. Paul became unstoppable, not when he gained power, but when he lost himself to a higher purpose. And once that happened, hell could no longer stop him, only slow him. But even that failed. Because when God decides to use someone, no force in heaven or hell can cancel that calling. If this message resonates with you, if you feel that inner confirmation that this is speaking to your life, then you are not listening by accident. Subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will explain why the attacks you faced were not meant to destroy you, but to prepare you for something far greater than you imagined. The resistance was never about Paul. It was about what he carried. When people read the story of Paul, they often focus on his actions, his words, his travels, his writings. But what they miss is the invisible tension that surrounded his entire life. The opposition he faced was not personal. It was not emotional. It was not circumstantial. It was spiritual. And more specifically, it was targeted at what he carried, not who he was. This is one of the deepest truths in spiritual warfare. Hell does not fight people, it fights assignments. Paul's life before Christ already hinted at this reality. He was educated, disciplined, respected, and fiercely committed. Even while persecuting Christians, he operated with intensity and conviction. These traits did not disappear after his conversion. They were redirected. What once fueled destruction became the engine for transformation. And this is precisely why hell reacted so violently when Paul encountered Christ. The enemy is not afraid of broken people. He is afraid of people who will eventually realize who they are in God. When Paul fell on the road to Damascus, something happened that shook the spiritual realm. A man who had been unknowingly serving darkness was suddenly realigned with truth. That kind of shift sends shockwaves through the unseen world, because a person who once fought for the wrong side, once converted, becomes twice as dangerous. They understand the tactics, they recognize the lies, they know the terrain. This is why Paul's journey after conversion was marked by relentless opposition. Shipwrecks, imprisonments, beatings, betrayals, hunger, isolation, false accusations, every form of resistance imaginable. And yet he did not stop, he did not retreat, he did not lose clarity. Why? Because the battle was never about comfort. It was about influence. Hell knew that if Paul completed his assignment, the message of Christ would spread beyond cultural, ethnic, and geographic boundaries. It would no longer be confined. It would multiply. It would reach people who had never heard the name of Jesus, and once that happened, control would be lost. This is why opposition often increases when you are about to cross a threshold in your life. There is a moment, often subtle, when you step closer to your purpose. You may not even realize it consciously, but spiritually something shifts. Your decisions change, your values sharpen, your discernment grows, and suddenly things that once worked no longer do. Relationships strain, opportunities collapse, peace feels distant, confusion tries to settle in. Many people interpret this as failure. In reality, it is often resistance. Paul experienced this repeatedly. Every time he entered a new city, conflict followed, not because he was reckless, but because light provokes reaction. Truth disturbs systems built on illusion. Presence disrupts comfort. And when truth arrives, it exposes what darkness has hidden. This is why the enemy prefers distraction over direct attack. If he can keep you busy, tired, discouraged, or doubting yourself, he doesn't need to destroy you. He only needs to delay you. And delay over time becomes one of the most effective weapons against purpose. But Paul refused to be delayed. Even when imprisoned, he wrote letters. Even when beaten, he preached. Even when misunderstood, he persisted. He understood something most people never realize. Circumstances do not define calling. Obedience does. And this is where the enemy miscalculates. Hell assumes that pressure will cause retreat, that pain will lead to silence, that hardship will produce fear. But in those who are truly called, pressure produces clarity, pain produces depth, resistance produces endurance. Paul's letters were not written from comfort, they were written from confinement. Some of the most powerful words in Scripture came from chains, darkness, and isolation, which reveals something profound. Sometimes the place meant to silence you becomes the place where your voice grows strongest. The enemy underestimated this. He assumed suffering would break Paul. Instead, it refined him. He assumed isolation would weaken him. Instead, it strengthened his dependence on God. He assumed rejection would destroy his confidence. Instead, it purified his motives. And this is where many people misunderstand their own struggles. You may think life is unfair because things feel harder for you than for others. But what if the pressure you feel is not punishment, but preparation? What if the resistance is not meant to stop you, but to shape you into someone capable of carrying what is coming? Paul's calling required endurance. It required depth. It required humility. It required spiritual authority that could not be developed in comfort. And so the process was intense. Hell did not try to stop Paul because he was weak. It tried to stop him because he was becoming strong in the only way that matters: through surrender. And here is the most important truth. The same pattern still exists today. If you feel like life has tested you beyond what seems reasonable, if you have experienced repeated setbacks despite good intentions, if you feel misunderstood, delayed, or isolated, if you have tried to do what is right and still faced resistance, it may not be because you are doing something wrong. It may be because you are carrying something that threatens the status quo. The enemy does not fight people who blend in. He fights those who stand out spiritually, those who ask deeper questions, those who refuse to conform, those who seek truth instead of comfort. And when he cannot stop you, he tries to exhaust you. But exhaustion is not defeat. Paul teaches us that endurance is not passive. It is active faith. It is choosing to continue when nothing makes sense. It is trusting that God sees what you cannot. It is walking forward even when the path feels dark. And this is the part many miss. Hell's resistance is often proof that heaven has already approved you. If the enemy had authority over your destiny, he would not need to fight you. The very fact that he resists is evidence that your life is not his to control. Paul understood this. That is why he could say with conviction that nothing, not life, not death, not angels, not demons, could separate him from the purpose God had given him. And the same is true for you. If this message resonates with you, if you feel this speaking directly to your life, then this is not coincidence. Subscribe to the channel now, because the next part will reveal how hell's strategies fail completely when a person fully understands who they are and refuses to turn back, no matter the cost. Why the enemy tries to break you before you discover who you are. There is a moment in every spiritually significant life when the pressure intensifies without explanation. Nothing exterior seems to justify it. Circumstances shift, relationships strain, motivation weakens, doubt creeps in, and the mind begins to ask the most dangerous question of all: what is wrong with me? This moment is not accidental. It is the moment before awareness. Paul experienced this long before he understood what was happening. His life did not suddenly become difficult after he met Christ. Difficulty was already following him. The difference was that before his conversion, he interpreted pressure as purpose. After his conversion, he had to learn that pressure often precedes clarity. The enemy understands something that most people do not. Identity, once fully realized, cannot be undone. So the strategy is never to fight your destiny directly. The strategy is to exhaust you before you understand it. This is why confusion is one of the most effective spiritual weapons. If the enemy can keep you questioning your worth, doubting your calling, or believing you are behind in life, he doesn't need to stop you physically. He only needs to delay your realization. Because once a person knows who they are in God, fear loses its grip. Paul's life illustrates this with brutal clarity. Before his encounter with Christ, he was confident, driven, and certain, but his certainty was misdirected. After his encounter, everything changed, not externally at first, but internally. The old identity had to collapse before the new one could form. And that collapse was not gentle. There is a period that many believers go through that feels like disorientation. Old desires fade. Old motivations no longer satisfy, but the new direction has not yet become clear. This is one of the most dangerous phases of spiritual growth, because in this space, people are vulnerable. They are more likely to return to old habits, more likely to doubt themselves, more likely to assume they have failed, more likely to believe the lie that they have missed their chance. But what is actually happening is restructuring. Paul spent years in obscurity after his conversion, years, not preaching to crowds, not performing miracles publicly, not being celebrated. He was learning, unlearning, being reshaped. And during this time, hell did not stop working against him, because the enemy knows something about process. Transformation does not happen instantly. It happens in layers. And if a person can be broken emotionally during this stage, they may never reach the phase where their impact becomes visible. This is why so many people give up just before clarity arrives. The enemy exploits fatigue. He whispers that the struggle will never end, that you are alone, that God has forgotten you, that your efforts are meaningless. And if you listen long enough, those whispers begin to sound like your own thoughts. Paul faced this same psychological pressure. He wrote openly about despair, fear, exhaustion, and moments where death seemed preferable to continuing. Yet he also wrote something extraordinary, that strength is perfected in weakness. This was not poetic language, it was experience. Paul realized that the moments when he felt most powerless were the moments when God's power was most active. Because when human strength collapses, divine strength can finally operate without interference. This is why the enemy works so hard to keep people strong in the wrong ways. Proud, self-reliant, controlled, guarded. Those qualities feel like protection, but they actually block transformation. The enemy does not fear your confidence. He fears your surrender. And surrender is terrifying to the ego. It feels like loss. It feels like defeat. It feels like giving up control. But in reality, it is the doorway to clarity. Paul did not become powerful by trying harder. He became powerful when he stopped resisting the process, when he stopped fighting his own weakness, when he accepted that his strength would come from obedience, not effort. This is why the enemy tries to break people before they understand who they are. If you never discover your identity, you will spend your life trying to prove yourself. If you never understand your calling, you will chase validation instead of purpose. If you never recognize your value, you will settle for survival instead of impact. And hell prefers you tired, busy, distracted, and doubting, rather than aware, grounded, and focused. This is also why spiritual pressure often increases when you are close to clarity. The closer you get to understanding yourself, the louder the resistance becomes. Old fears resurface, old wounds reopen, old voices return, not because you are regressing, but because something is trying to stop your breakthrough. Paul learned to recognize this pattern. He stopped interpreting hardship as punishment and began to see it as confirmation. He understood that the intensity of the battle often reflected the importance of the assignment, and instead of retreating, he leaned in. This is what made him dangerous. He no longer asked, "Why is this happening to me?" He began to ask, "What is this preparing me for?" And that shift changed everything. Once you understand this, fear loses its authority. Pain loses its confusion. Struggle gains meaning. You stop seeing obstacles as signs of failure and start recognizing them as evidence of movement. The enemy wants you to believe that resistance means you are on the wrong path. In reality, resistance often means you are finally on the right one. Paul's life proves this. The more he aligned with truth, the more resistance he faced. The more he obeyed, the more pressure came. The more he surrendered, the stronger the opposition became. And yet, none of it stopped him. Because once a person understands who they are, fear has nothing left to say. If you feel like your life has been a series of battles you never asked for, if you feel like you have been tested in ways others haven't, if you feel like you have been pushed, stretched, and pressured beyond what seems fair, it may be because your life carries weight, and the enemy knows it. If this message speaks to you, if it feels uncomfortably accurate, then stay with this channel. What comes next will explain why the enemy ultimately fails against those who refuse to turn back, and how understanding this truth changes everything. Subscribe to the channel now, because the next part reveals how spiritual authority is formed through endurance, and why hell cannot stop someone who has fully awakened to their purpose. The moment hell realizes it has lost control over you. There is a moment in the life of every person who walks in purpose when something shifts silently but irreversibly. It is not dramatic. There is no visible sign, no announcement, no applause. Yet in the spiritual realm, everything changes. This is the moment when hell realizes it no longer has access to you the way it once did. Paul reached this moment after years of pressure, suffering, confusion, and relentless resistance. Not because the attacks stopped, but because they stopped working. This is the stage the enemy fears the most. Up until this point, the enemy operates under the assumption that fear can still influence you, that pain can still slow you down, that uncertainty can still weaken your resolve. But once a person reaches a certain depth of understanding, those tools lose their power. Paul no longer feared loss. He no longer feared rejection. He no longer feared death. He no longer feared isolation. And when fear disappears, control disappears with it. This is why the enemy fights hardest before this stage. Because once someone crosses this threshold, intimidation no longer works, threats become meaningless, pressure becomes irrelevant, and manipulation loses its effectiveness. Paul reached a place where suffering no longer confused him. It clarified him. He understood that discomfort did not mean disfavor. He understood that pain was not proof of failure. He understood that delay was not denial. And most importantly, he understood that nothing happening to him could separate him from what God had already decided. That realization is devastating to darkness, because the enemy's power depends on uncertainty. Fear only works when a person believes something bad might happen. Doubt only works when a person is unsure of their standing. Guilt only works when a person believes they are unworthy. But once those beliefs collapse, the enemy loses leverage. Paul was no longer trying to protect himself. He was no longer trying to preserve comfort or reputation. He had already accepted the cost. And when someone accepts the cost fully, fear has nowhere to attach itself. This is why his later writings carry such authority. He was not speaking theoretically. He was not guessing. He was speaking from a place of surrender so complete that death itself no longer intimidated him. This is what hell could not stop. Not his preaching, not his intelligence, not his influence, but his freedom. A person who is no longer afraid to lose has already won. This is the moment many never reach. They want purpose, but they also want safety. They want calling, but without discomfort. They want growth, but without loss. They want transformation, but without surrender. Paul understood that transformation demands everything, and once he gave everything, the battle changed. The enemy no longer tried to destroy him, only to slow him. No longer tried to break him, only to distract him. No longer tried to silence him, only to exhaust him. But even that failed, because Paul had crossed the line where endurance becomes natural. He no longer asked, "Why is this happening?" He asked, "How can I remain faithful within this?" That shift is everything. It marks the transition from spiritual childhood to spiritual maturity. And it is at this point that hell truly loses its grip. Because control requires emotional access. Control requires fear. Control requires reaction. But when someone learns to stand unmoved, the enemy has no foothold. Paul's peace did not come from comfort. It came from clarity. He knew who he was. He knew who God was, and he knew that nothing happening around him had the authority to change what had already been decided in heaven. This is the state the enemy fears most, not power, not miracles, not charisma, but unshakable alignment. This is why so many people experience a strange calm after long seasons of struggle. A quiet confidence, a stillness that doesn't depend on circumstances, a sense of grounding that no longer rises and falls with life's chaos. That calm is not weakness, it is stability, it is spiritual adulthood. And once you reach this place, the attacks change. They become quieter, subtler, more psychological than external, because the enemy knows loud opposition no longer works. But even then, it is too late, because once you have seen through fear, you cannot unsee it. Once you have walked through pain and survived, you cannot be threatened by it. Once you understand your purpose, confusion loses its power. Paul reached that point, and from there on, Nothing could stop what God was doing through him. Not prisons, not chains, not betrayal, not abandonment, not death. His life became a testimony not of ease, but of endurance, and endurance, when fully formed, becomes unbreakable. If you feel like something inside you has changed recently, if fear no longer controls you the way it once did, if you feel less reactive, more grounded, more aware, if you sense a strange calm even in uncertainty, you may be standing at the same threshold, the place where hell realizes it no longer controls your responses, the place where fear loses its authority, the place where purpose becomes stronger than pain. And once you cross it, there is no going back. If this message speaks to you, if you recognize yourself in this process, then stay connected. What comes next will explain the final shift, the moment when resistance turns into momentum and purpose becomes unstoppable. Subscribe to the channel now, because the final part reveals how everything you endured was not meant to break you, but to prepare you for impact beyond what you imagined. When hell finally understands it can no longer stop you, there comes a moment in the life of someone who has endured enough, learned enough, and surrendered deeply enough when resistance changes form. Not because the battle is over, but because the enemy realizes something unsettling. You are no longer breakable in the ways you once were. This moment does not arrive with noise. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, often disguised as exhaustion, silence, or detachment. But spiritually, it is one of the most significant shifts a person can experience. This is the moment when hell understands that it has lost its grip. Paul reached this point not through victory, but through endurance, not through triumph, but through persistence, not through success, but through faithfulness in suffering. By the time he reached the latter part of his life, the enemy was no longer trying to destroy him. That phase had passed. Instead, the opposition shifted into something subtler: limitation. When destruction fails, limitation becomes the final strategy. This is when the enemy attempts to make you believe that your influence is small, that your impact is minimal, that your voice no longer matters. Not because it is true, but because discouragement is the last door left open once fear and doubt no longer work. But Paul had already crossed the line. He had accepted that his life was not his own. He had accepted that comfort was not the goal. He had accepted that obedience mattered more than outcome. And in that acceptance, he became untouchable. The enemy could take his freedom. The enemy could take his reputation. The enemy could take his body. But he could not take his clarity. And clarity is power. This is the point most people never reach. They live their entire lives negotiating with fear, compromising with doubt, adjusting their identity to fit their circumstances. Paul refused to do this. He allowed circumstances to shape his character, but never his purpose. By the time he wrote his final letters, there was no desperation left in his words. Only resolve, only peace, only certainty. He was not fighting anymore. He was finishing. And there is a difference. Fighting is reactive. Finishing is intentional. The enemy thrives in reaction. He collapses in the face of intention. When a person reaches the stage where they no longer need validation, no longer need recognition, no longer need approval, the enemy loses access. There is nothing left to manipulate. This is why the final stage of spiritual maturity feels strangely quiet. No chaos, no drama, no urgency, just direction. Paul did not rush. He did not panic. He did not beg for relief. He walked forward with the calm assurance of someone who knew the outcome was already decided. This is what it means to live from destiny instead of fear. And this is what hell cannot stop, because hell only operates within uncertainty. It feeds on hesitation. It thrives on insecurity. But when someone stands rooted in truth, unmoved by outcome, unafraid of loss, the system collapses. This is why the enemy fought so hard at the beginning. This is why the pressure was so intense. This is why the confusion felt overwhelming. Because if you reach this point, there is no turning you back. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" You start saying, "I understand now." You stop seeking validation. You start walking in conviction. You stop fearing the future. You start trusting the process. And once that shift happens, your life changes permanently, not because circumstances improve immediately, but because you do. Paul's life teaches us that the goal was never comfort, it was transformation. And transformation only happens when resistance has done its work and failed. The enemy tried to stop Paul before he began. He tried to exhaust him along the way. He tried to silence him near the end. None of it worked. Because Paul was no longer living for survival, he was living for purpose. And purpose cannot be threatened. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels settled, if you feel a strange sense of recognition, if this message feels less like information and more like confirmation, then understand this. You are not behind. You are not lost. You are not failing. You are becoming. And the resistance you survived was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to prepare you for a level of clarity and strength that few ever reach. Hell tried to stop Paul because it knew what he would become. And if you are feeling that same pressure, that same resistance, that same weight, then perhaps it is because something in you carries the same kind of purpose. If this message spoke to you, if it helped you understand your own journey more clearly, then subscribe to the channel now. What comes next will continue to reveal the deeper meaning behind spiritual resistance, identity, and the strength that emerges when you finally stop fighting and start becoming who you were always meant to be.